After World War I, the Finns broke away from what became the Soviet Union. Later on in 1937, Stalin purged the officer corps. His military, though large in number, was short when it came to experienced leaders. Germany and the Soviet Union jointly invaded Poland. However, that was Germany doing most of the fighting, and Russia kind of walked in the back door after everything was really said and done, and claimed their part of Poland. They were able to strong-arm the rest of Eastern Europe, and as the war began to unfold, they looked towards getting some land back that they had lost, namely Finland. Welcome to the History Book, short snippets of history which are odd or lesser known, and I try to keep videos at 5 to 7 minutes long, just enough to keep your interest and that you can move forward with the rest of your day. If you do like the content, consider subscribing, and if you really do like the content, please consider getting on board with our Patreon account. Every dollar helps out with the channel. So thank you so much. Here's the rest of the video. The Finnish themselves were actually under Mannerheim, and he proved to be a very astute tactician and an innovator. When it came time for the almost 8-to-1 odds of the attack from the Russians into Finland, you'd think the Finnish would have folded like origami. But in fact, they put up one heck of a fight and used everything to their advantage. The Russo-Finnish War, that gets lost in history because of the invasion of Poland and, well, World War II. The Winter War was fought between Finland and the Soviet Union, and the Soviet forces began the war November 30th, 1939. And it was pretty much concluded by March 12th, 1940, with the Peace of Moscow. In November, the Soviet Union demanded that the Finns move the border back 25 kilometers from Leningrad and grant them a 30-year lease on the Hanko Peninsula, mostly for construction of a naval base. In exchange, the Soviets offered a large tract of the Karelian wilderness in return. It was termed as exchanging 2 pounds of dirt for 1 pound of gold by the Finns, and the offer was flatly refused. And not to be denied, the Soviets began massing approximately 1 million men along the Finnish border. On November 26th of 1939, the Soviets sort of faked a Finnish shelling of a Russian town called Manila. In the aftermath of the shelling, they demanded that the Finns apologize and withdraw their force from the border. Of course, the Finns denied any responsibility. They didn't have anything to do with this, so they flatly refused. And 4 days later, about 450,000 Soviet troops crossed the border. They were met by a small Finnish army, which initially had only 180,000 soldiers. The Finns were badly outnumbered in all areas during the conflict. The Soviets had superiority in armored aircraft. It was like 6,500 to 30, and then the aircraft was like 3,800 to maybe 120, 130. The Finns were led by Carl Gustav Mannerheim. The Finnish forces manned the Mannerheim Line across the Karelian Isthmus. They were anchored on the Gulf of Finland up to Lake Ladoga, and this fortified line saw some of the heaviest fighting in the conflict. Though the Soviet forces were overseen by Marshal Mereteskov, they suffered heavy losses. Of course, it didn't help that Stalin had purged the Red Army in 1937 of a great deal of its officers. So the advancing Soviets had really not anticipated any heavy resistance, and they also lacked winter supplies and equipment. Generally, the Soviets would attack in regiments, and they had dark clothing on, as opposed to the Finnish, who had white clothing on based on, well, it was winter. And there were staggering losses on the Soviet side. So camouflage played a huge role in this. There was even a sniper that had over 500 kills. And the Soviets used mobility as a main method. And then the Finns would jump on the tracks of enemy tanks with a log to stop it, and then use Molotov cocktails to detonate the fuel tank. So over 2,000 Soviet tanks were destroyed using this method, and they effectively halted the Soviets throughout December. The Finns won a stunning victory on the Raiti Road in early January of 1940, and it isolated the 44th Infantry Division, which was about 25,000 men. The Finnish 9th Division was able to break the enemy column into small pockets, and they were then destroyed. Over 17,500 men were killed in exchange for about 250 Finns. All the way up until February of 1940, the Finns really had the upper hand. Their hit-and-run tactics, ability to blend into the snow, they were doing a fantastic job of handling this war against just terrible, terrible odds. The Mannerheim line held. On February 11th, Marshal Timoshenko took over, and they finally achieved a breakthrough on the Mannerheim line. With Mannerheim's ammunition and supply nearly exhausted, he had no choice but to withdraw, and they went into defensive positions. From then on in, it was a defensive war, and the Finns were being pushed back continually. The situation continued to worsen through February, with the Finns falling back. The Allies officially requested transit rights from Norway and Sweden, but were denied. Also, Sweden continued to refuse to intervene directly in the conflict. With all hope of substantial outside assistance lost, Finland dispatched a party to Moscow on March 6 to begin the peace negotiations. Finland had been under pressure from both Sweden and Germany for nearly a month to seek an end to the conflict, as neither nation had wished to see a Soviet takeover. After several days of talks, a treaty was completed on March 12, which ended the fighting. By the terms of the Peace of Moscow, Finland ceded all Finnish Karelia, part of Salla, 4 small islands in the Baltic, and was granted a lease of the Hanko Peninsula. This was almost all of Finland's industrialized territory and 12% of its population. However, interestingly enough, those living in the affected areas were permitted to move to Finland or to become Soviet citizens. The Winter War proved to be a costly victory for the Soviets. In the fighting, they lost approximately 126,000 dead or missing and about 264,000 wounded. About 5,000 plus were captured, and in addition, they lost around 2,200 tanks and armored cars. The casualties for the Finns numbered around 26,000 dead and about 39,000 wounded. The Soviets' poor performance in the Winter War led Hitler to believe that Stalin's military could be easily defeated if attacked. He attempted to put this to the test when Germany's forces launched Operation Barbarossa in 1941. The Finns renewed their conflict with the Soviets in June of 1941, with their forces operating in conjunction with, but not allied to, the Germans. Now you know your history.